The sleek corridors of the Nexus Academy hummed with the whispered conversations of a dozen alien species, their bioluminescent skin patterns and crystalline appendages, creating a kaleidoscope of colors against the pristine white walls. At the center of this prestigious institution, in classroom Delta 7, Professor Marcus Chun stood before his mixed-species advanced theoretical physics class, his plain human features unremarkable among the exotic beauty of his students. Today we'll explore the relationship between consciousness and temporal mechanics, Marcus said, his voice carrying the patient warmth that had become his trademark over the past 3 years. Zixandra, a towering crystalline whose faceted body refracted light into dancing rainbows, let out what could only be described as a sonic sneer. Professor, with respect, how can a human, a species that barely mastered fusion energy, possibly comprehend the intricacies of time manipulation? That my people have studied for millennia? The classroom erupted in various forms of alien laughter. Kethmer, whose chitinous exoskeleton clicked rhythmically when amused, translated for his less technologically advanced classmates. She questions whether a primitive primate can teach evolved beings about temporal dynamics. Marcus smiled gently, seemingly unperturbed by the mockery. An interesting perspective, Zixandra. Tell me, how does your species currently approach time travel? We use quantum crystalline matrices to create stable temporal corridors, she replied smugly. The mathematics alone would overwhelm human computational capacity. And yet, Marcus said, turning to the holographic display behind him, you've never successfully traveled more than a few decades into the past, correct? Your people speak of ancient times as mysterious and unknowable. The crystalline's light dimmed slightly, a sign of uncertainty. The deeper past is ... unstable. Our technology cannot penetrate beyond certain temporal barriers. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and began sketching seemingly simple diagrams on the display spirals within spirals, with numerical sequences that looked almost childish compared to the complex equations the students were accustomed to. Perhaps the issue isn't technological sophistication, but perspective. What if time isn't a river to be navigated, but an ocean to be inhabited? Velther, a gaseous being whose form constantly shifted within a containment suit, pulsed with what his species considered amusement. Professor Chun, your metaphors are ... quaint, but surely you understand that temporal mechanics require mathematical precision far beyond human capability. We study you humans as a baseline, the minimum threshold of intelligence required for spacefaring civilization. The other students murmured agreement, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of condescension. To them, humans were useful as a reference point, the bottom rung of the galactic intelligence ladder. Earth's recent admission to the Galactic Collective had been seen as an act of charity, a way to help a struggling species catch up to civilizations that had mastered interstellar travel when humanity was still discovering fire. I appreciate your honesty, Velther, Marcus replied, his expression never wavering from its gentle patience. But consider this. What if the very assumptions underlying your understanding of intelligence are ... incomplete? He turned back to his diagrams, adding layers of complexity that seemed to emerge naturally from the simple spirals. To the students, it looked like a child's attempt to complicate basic geometry. They couldn't see what Marcus saw, the elegant mathematical poetry that described not just time travel, but the fundamental architecture of existence itself. Nira, a young empathic whose purple-scaled skin shifted color with her emotions, was the only one who seemed genuinely interested rather than amused. Her empathic abilities allowed her to sense something the others missed. Beneath Professor Chun's humble exterior lay depths that made her species' legendary emotional intelligence feel shallow by comparison. Professor, she said hesitantly, your diagrams, there's something familiar about them, but I can't place it. It's like remembering a dream. Marcus's eyes met hers across the classroom, And for just a moment, Nira glimpsed something that made her catch her breath. In that brief instant, she saw not the patient human teacher they all knew, but something vast and ancient and impossibly wise, a consciousness that contained eons of experience compressed into the humble form before them. Dreams, Marcus said, softly, are often memories of futures we haven't lived yet. The comment was vintage Professor Chun mystical sounding, but ultimately meaningless, the other students thought. They returned to their quiet mockery, discussing among themselves how humans always tried to sound profound when they lacked actual knowledge. But Nira continued to study her teacher's face, her empathic senses detecting layers of experience that seemed to stretch far beyond any individual lifetime. Something was not as it appeared in classroom Delta 7, and as the lesson continued, she began to suspect that their primitive, human teacher might be harboring secrets that would reshape everything they thought they knew about intelligence. Evolution, and the true history of the galaxy. 3 weeks after Nira's unsettling glimpse into Professor Chun's true nature, the Nexus Academy faced its first major crisis. The Temporal Research Laboratory's experimental chronometer, a device built using technology from 7 different species, had malfunctioned during a routine calibration test. The resulting temporal distortion was growing exponentially, threatening to tear a hole in space-time that could destabilize the entire sector. The Academy's most brilliant minds gathered in the emergency council chamber, their various forms of panic creating a cacophony of colors, sounds, and energy discharges. Dean Mordex, whose ancient hive mind species had collectively governed the Academy for centuries, projected his distress through bioelectric pulses that made the air itself seem to vibrate with urgency. The cascade is accelerating beyond our models, announced Dr. Zixandra, her crystalline form now pulsing with deep red warning patterns. Our combined technological approaches have failed. The temporal breach will reach critical mass in 6 hours. Kethmer's chitinous plates clicked rapidly as he processed probability matrices faster than most organic minds could follow. Evacuation. Protocols are insufficient. The distortion field will expand faster than our ships can achieve safe distance. In the back of the chamber, seemingly forgotten among the galaxy's greatest intellects, Professor Marcus Chun sat quietly observing. The panic. His human features remained calm, while alien minds that had mastered technologies beyond Earth's comprehension struggled with forces they couldn't control. Velthur's gaseous forms swirled with agitation. Perhaps we should contact the ancients. Archive, though their response time makes rescue unlikely. The ancients have been silent for millennia, Dean Mordex responded. We cannot rely on myths when facing extinction. Marcus finally stood, his movement so subtle that most didn't notice until he spoke. May I examine the chronometer's operational data? The chamber fell into what could charitably be called bemused silence. Dr. Vexlin, whose cybernetic implants had replaced most of his original brain with quantum processors, actually laughed a sound like grinding metal. Professor Chun, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, this is somewhat beyond introductory temporal theory. The mathematics alone would require processing power that human brains simply cannot. Zixandra began, but Marcus was already at the central display, his fingers moving across the holographic interface with startling precision. What happened next defied every assumption the assembled experts held about human capability. Marcus didn't struggle with the complex equations, he rewrote them. The impossibly intricate mathematical models that had taken their greatest minds years to develop were simplified, corrected, and reorganized in minutes. Your foundational equations contain an elegant error, Marcus said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Your treating time is linear when it's actually spiral helical. The distortion isn't chaotic, it's following a pattern you can't see because you're thinking in 3 dimensions plus time, rather than understanding that time itself has dimensional depth. He gestured to the display, where his modifications had transformed the chaotic readouts into something resembling a complex but comprehensible wave pattern. The breach can be sealed, but it requires understanding temporal mechanics from a perspective that your current evolutionary stages haven't yet developed. The silence that followed was different from before, heavy, with shock rather than condescension. Nira watched her teacher with her empathic senses fully extended, and what she perceived made her species' advanced emotional intelligence feel primitive. The consciousness she touched wasn't just vast, it was layered with experiences from timelines that hadn't happened yet, memories of civilizations that existed millions of years in the future. Dean Mordick's hive mind collectively focused on Marcus with an intensity that made the air crackle. Professor Chun, your analysis suggests comprehension of temporal mechanics that surpasses our most advanced theoretical frameworks. This is unprecedented for your species. Marcus turned from the display, and for the first time since they'd known him, his expression held something other than gentle patience. There was weight behind his eyes, the kind of weariness that came from carrying knowledge too vast for any single lifetime. "What if I told you," he said quietly, "that your understanding of species development, of intelligence, of the galaxy's history itself, is based on a fundamental misconception?" Kethmer's processing speed actually stuttered. "Impossible. The evolutionary timeline is well documented. Humans achieved space travel mere centuries ago. Your species is still in its technological infancy. Are we?" Marcus asked, and something in his tone made even the most skeptical pause. "Or are you observing humanity at one specific point in a much longer timeline, a point we chose to occupy, for reasons you cannot yet comprehend?" He returned to the temporal display, his hands moving with the fluid certainty of someone who had performed these calculations countless times before. "I can seal the breach, but doing so will require me to reveal capabilities that will fundamentally alter your understanding of human potential." The assembled minds processed this statement with varying degrees of disbelief and growing unease. If a human, a member of the galaxy's supposedly least advanced species, could solve a crisis that had stumped their greatest intellects, then everything they believed about intelligence, evolution, and their place in the cosmic hierarchy was wrong. "Proceed," Dean Mordex commanded, though his bioelectric patterns betrayed deep uncertainty. Marcus nodded and placed his hands on the chronometer's control interface. What happened next would be remembered as the moment the galaxy's understanding of reality fundamentally changed. As Marcus placed his hands on the chronometer's control interface, the device responded in ways that defied every law of physics the assembled experts thought they understood. The chaotic temporal distortion that had been growing exponentially suddenly stabilized, its violent fluctuations smoothing into elegant, predictable waves. But it wasn't just the technical impossibility that stunned the observers. It was the way Marcus worked. His consciousness seemed to expand beyond the confines of his human form, interfacing directly with the chronometer's quantum matrices. The air around him began to shimmer with temporal displacement fields that should have required massive energy expenditures and complex machinery to generate. "Impossible," Dr. Vexlin whispered, his cybernetic implants struggling to process what they were detecting. "He's manipulating time directly, without technological interface. The energy requirements alone should." His voice trailed off as the readings on his instruments became increasingly incomprehensible. The temporal breach wasn't just being sealed, it was being rewoven. Its disruptive energies transformed into stabilizing forces that actually strengthened the local space-time matrix. Nira's empathic abilities were being overwhelmed by what she sensed from Marcus. His consciousness wasn't just vast, it existed on multiple temporal levels simultaneously. She could feel echoes of his presence stretching both forward and backward through time, as if he existed as a continuous entity across millions of years of linear history. "Professor Chun," Dean Mordex said carefully, his hive mind's collective processing power straining to comprehend what they were witnessing. Your methods suggest familiarity with technologies and techniques that won't be developed for millennia. This is beyond theoretical knowledge. This is practical experience. Marcus's hands moved in complex patterns above the chronometer, and reality itself seemed to bend around his gestures. The temporal breach began to collapse inward, its chaotic energies being guided into harmless dissipation patterns that looked almost like a dance. Experience, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before, frequencies that seemed to resonate with the fundamental vibrations of space-time itself. Yes, I have experience, more than any of you could imagine. Zixandra's crystalline form was now pulsing with patterns of fear rather than anger. You speak as if you've sealed temporal breaches before, as if you've encountered these technologies in their fully developed forms. I have, Marcus said simply, and the casual way he delivered this impossibility made it somehow more terrifying than any dramatic revelation could have been. Many times, in many different timelines, in futures where your species have evolved, far beyond your current understanding, and in timelines where they never evolved at all. The temporal breach collapsed with a sound like reality sighing in relief. The emergency alerts throughout the academy fell silent, replaced by the gentle hum of normal space-time operations. But the true crisis was just beginning, the crisis of understanding what they had just witnessed. Kethmer's chitinous plates were clicking in patterns that indicated severe cognitive strain. You're suggesting you have direct experience with our futures, that you've observed the evolution of our species across temporal scales that span millions of years. Not observed, Marcus corrected, turning away from the now stabilized chronometer. As he did, the strange harmonics in his voice faded, and he appeared to shrink back into the humble human form they knew. But the illusion was shattered now. They had seen too much to ever again believe in his supposed limitations. I didn't observe your futures, he continued. I lived through them. I watched your species achieve wonders it would seem like magic to your current selves. I witnessed the birth of technologies that can reshape reality itself. And I learned from civilizations that your descendants will become. The assembled minds struggled with concepts that challenged their most fundamental assumptions. Velther S. Gaseous forms swirled in patterns that indicated deep philosophical distress. If what you claim is true, then humans aren't the primitive species we believe them to be. Humans, Marcus said, and now there was something sad in his expression, are not what you think they are. Not what I've allowed you to think they are. The species you observe today, struggling with basic interstellar technology, represents humanity at one specific point in its development, a point chosen for very particular reasons. Neera found her voice, though it shook with the implications of what she was sensing. You're not just from the future, are you? You're not even entirely human anymore, in the way we understand the term. Marcus met her empathic gaze, and this time he didn't hide what he truly was. Neera gasped as she perceived the full scope of his consciousness, a being that had transcended individual existence, that carried within himself the accumulated wisdom and experience of humanity's entire evolutionary timeline. I am what humanity becomes, he said quietly. After millions of years of growth, after transcending physical limitation, after learning to navigate not just space, but time itself. I am a temporal archaeologist, sent back to study and understand the pivotal moments that shaped galactic civilization. The revelation hung in the air like a fundamental force of nature, impossible to deny, impossible to fully comprehend. Everything they thought they knew about intelligence, about evolution, about the hierarchy of galactic species, had just been revealed as a carefully maintained illusion. And in the depths of her empathic perception, Neera began to understand the most unsettling truth of all. If Marcus represented humanity's ultimate evolution, Then every other species in the galaxy was still, climbing toward a pinnacle that humans had already surpassed eons ago. The teacher they had mocked as primitive was actually observing them from heights of development they couldn't even imagine. In the days following Marcus's revelation, the Nexus Academy became a pressure cooker of philosophical and existential crisis. Word of the impossible temporal breach resolution had spread throughout the galactic network, bringing representatives from dozens of species to witness what many were calling either the greatest discovery or the most dangerous deception in recorded history. The Academy's Grand Assembly Hall, designed to accommodate the diverse physiological needs of 73 different species, had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. Holographic projections from across the galaxy flickered alongside physical representatives, creating a cacophony of colors, sounds, and energy patterns that would have been overwhelming to most human senses. But Marcus observed it all with the patient detachment of someone who had witnessed similar scenes play out across countless timelines. High Arbiter Kath Morin of the Galactic Collective, whose energy-based species existed as pure consciousness within crystalline matrices, materialized at the center of the assembly. Their voice resonated through dimensional frequencies that most species could only partially perceive. "Professor Chun," the Arbiter began, "your claims challenge the fundamental principles upon which galactic civilization is built. If true, they suggest that our understanding of evolutionary development, technological progression, and species hierarchy is not merely incomplete, it is inversely wrong." Marcus stood before the assembly in his simple human form, seemingly dwarfed by the exotic magnificence surrounding him. But those who had witnessed the temporal breach incident could no longer see him as small or limited. There was something vast contained within that unremarkable exterior, something that made even the most advanced civilizations present feel like children playing with toys they didn't fully understand. "Not wrong," Marcus replied, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its conversational tone. "Simply, viewed from a limited perspective, you see the galaxy as it exists in this moment and extrapolate backward, assuming that technological sophistication equals evolutionary advancement. But time is not linear, and development is not always forward. Ambassador Crixtel of the Hegemony Worlds, whose cybernetic enhancement had replaced most of their original biology with quantum processing arrays, projected skepticism through their neural interface. You expect us to believe that humanity, species that achieved interstellar flight mere centuries ago, has somehow transcended every other civilization in the galaxy. Not transcended, Marcus corrected patiently. Evolved across millions of years that, from your perspective, haven't happened yet. I am not superhuman by the standards of my time. I am simply human after eons of growth and learning." He gestured to the assembly, and something in the movement caused the air itself to shimmer with temporal displacement. "Every species here will eventually reach similar evolutionary stages. Your descendants will develop capabilities that would seem godlike to your current selves. The difference is that humanity's journey through time has been non-linear." Dr. Zixandra, who had become something of an unwilling expert on Marcus since the incident, projected her question through harmonic crystalline resonance. "You speak of studying pivotal moments in galactic history. What moments? What are you here to observe?" Marcus's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment the assembled representatives glimpsed something that made several of them step back in instinctive recognition of predatory intelligence. "I am here to observe the moment when galactic civilization first begins to understand that intelligence is not about technological capability or processing power. It is about adaptability, empathy, and the willingness to grow beyond the limitations of one's current form." The implications of this statement rippled through the assembly like a shockwave. Nira, who had been granted special permission to attend despite her student status, felt the emotional resonance of thousands of beings simultaneously confronting the possibility that their most fundamental assumptions about existence were wrong. "You're saying," Dean Mordex ventured, his hive mind's collective processing struggling with the concept, "that what we consider advanced civilization is actually a developmental stage that humanity surpassed long ago?" "In your future, Marcus?" "Confirmed. From my temporal perspective, what you call the present is ancient history. I have lived through the rise and fall of empires that your species will build thousands of years from now. I have witnessed technologies that manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself. And I have learned that true advancement is not about conquering the universe. It is about understanding one's place within it." Velther's gaseous form swirled with agitation. "If this is true, then why the deception? Why allow us to believe humans are primitive? Why not reveal your true nature and guide galactic development?" Marcus smiled, and in that expression lay depths of wisdom that made the accumulated knowledge of entire civilizations seem shallow. "Because that is not how growth works. You cannot skip developmental stages. They must be experienced, learned from, integrated. My people tried direct intervention in several timelines. The results were ... catastrophic." He paused, and in that moment several empathic species in the assembly sensed something that chilled them: grief. Marcus carried within him the memory of civilizations that had been destroyed by premature revelation, of species that had collapsed under the weight of knowledge they weren't ready to bear. "I am here as an observer, and when absolutely necessary, as a gentle guide. My teaching methods seem simple to you because they are designed to plant seeds of understanding that will grow naturally as your species develop the capacity to nurture them." High Arbiter Cathmoran's crystalline matrix pulsed with complex calculations. "And what is the pivotal moment you are here to observe? What change in galactic civilization requires the presence of a temporal archaeologist?" Marcus looked around the assembly, his gaze touching each representative, each species, each unique form of consciousness present. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy, not prediction, but memory of things that had already come to pass in timelines yet to be lived. The moment when you stop seeing intelligence as hierarchy and begin to understand it as diversity. The moment when you realize that cooperation is not just beneficial, but essential for cosmic survival. The moment when you choose growth over dominance. He stood silently for a moment, letting the implications settle. That moment is now. Your response to this revelation, whether you choose to learn from it or reject it, will determine which timeline becomes reality. The assembly fell into stunned silence as the true scope of their situation became clear. They weren't just witnesses to a revelation, they were participants in a pivotal moment that would shape the future of galactic civilization itself. Part 5. The Choice. The week following Marcus's revelation to the Galactic Assembly was unlike anything in recorded history. Across thousands of worlds, billions of beings grappled with the fundamental reorganization of their understanding of existence itself. Some species demanded proof, others retreated into isolation, and still others began to question every assumption they had ever held about intelligence, evolution, and their place in the cosmic order. But it was in the quiet corridors of the Nexus Academy, far from the galactic media frenzy and political upheaval, that the most important conversations were taking place. Marcus had returned to his simple classroom, continuing to teach his advanced theoretical physics course as if nothing had changed, though everything had. His students sat in stunned silence as he sketched familiar diagrams on the holographic display. The same spirals and mathematical sequences that had once seemed childishly simple now revealed themselves as elegant blueprints for technologies their species wouldn't develop for millennia. "The beautiful thing about time," Marcus said conversationally, "is that it's always teaching us patience. Every moment contains the seeds of all future moments, but those seeds must be allowed to grow naturally. Zixandra, whose crystalline form had lost much of its usual arrogant luminescence, finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. Professor, if you've seen our futures, if you know how our civilizations develop, do we succeed? Do we become something worthy of your respect? Marcus paused in his drawing and turned to face his class. The beings who had once mocked him as primitive now watched him with a mixture of awe, fear, and desperate hope. He saw in their faces the same expression that had appeared on countless others across millions of years, the look of children suddenly realizing they were in the presence of a caring adult. "You become magnificent," he said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice made several students emit sounds of relief in their various forms of communication. "Each of your species develops capabilities that would astound your current selves. You learn to work together instead of competing. You discover that diversity of thought and experience is the greatest treasure in the universe." Kethmer's chitinous plates clicked nervously. "But you speak of multiple timelines, multiple possibilities. That suggests our success is not guaranteed." "No," Marcus agreed, "it is not. Every moment presents choices, and choices create new timelines. The future I've experienced is one possibility, a beautiful one, but not the only one." Nira, whose empathic abilities had grown stronger since her exposure to Marcus's vast consciousness, sensed something beneath his words. "There are darker timelines, aren't there? Ones where we don't choose cooperation." Marcus's expression grew heavy with memories of timelines where fear had triumphed over curiosity, where the revelation of human evolution had triggered galactic wars, species isolation, and ultimately civilizational collapse. "In some timelines," he said carefully, "the knowledge of what humanity becomes triggers fear instead of wonder. Species that cannot accept the possibility of growth beyond their current limitations turn inward, becoming stagnant and eventually extinct. Others attempt to prevent human development, creating paradoxes that unravel reality itself." The classroom fell into profound silence as the implications became clear. They weren't just learning about physics or temporal mechanics. They were participants in a moment that would determine the fate of galactic civilization. Velthur's gaseous form swirled with patterns of deep contemplation. "So our response to your revelation determines not just our individual futures, but the timeline that becomes reality for everyone." "Precisely," Marcus confirmed. "This is why I came back to this specific moment, to this specific configuration of species and circumstances. This is the pivot point, the moment when galactic civilization either chooses to grow together or fractures under the weight of its own limitations." Dean Mordex, who had been silent throughout the class, finally spoke through his hive mind interface. "What would you have us do, Professor? How do we ensure we choose the right path?" Marcus smiled, the same patient, gentle expression his students had once dismissed as simplistic naivety. "You do what you've been doing all along, just more consciously. You learn, you question, you grow. Most importantly, you remember that intelligence is not about being superior to others. It is about understanding your connection to everything else." He returned to his diagrams, adding new layers of complexity that seemed to emerge naturally from the simple foundations. "The universe is vast and full of wonders beyond imagination. There is room for every form of consciousness to grow and flourish. The choice is not between human dominance and everyone else's subjugation. It is between collective evolution and collective stagnation." As the class ended and students began to file out, each carrying with them the weight of cosmic responsibility, Nira lingered behind. Her empathic senses had detected something in Marcus's consciousness, profound loneliness that came from existing across multiple timelines simultaneously. "Professor," she said quietly, "will you stay with us as we grow? Or will you return to your own time once this pivotal moment passes. Marcus looked at her with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of eons, and for a moment she saw not the temporal archaeologist or the evolved human, but simply a teacher who had devoted himself to nurturing the growth of young minds across countless worlds and timelines. "I am where I need to be, when I need to be there," he said gently. "But Nira, remember this. The future is not a destination you arrive at. It is something you create through every choice you make. The beautiful timeline I've experienced exists because beings like you choose wisdom over fear, cooperation over competition, growth over stagnation." As she left the classroom, Nira carried with her the understanding that she and her classmates were no longer just students learning about the universe. They were active participants in shaping its destiny. The humble human teacher who had endured their mockery with infinite patience had revealed himself to be humanity's gift to the galaxy, not conquest or dominance, but the gentle guidance needed to help every species reach their own magnificent potential. And in classrooms across the Nexus Academy, in assembly halls throughout the Galactic Collective, and in the quiet contemplation chambers of thousands of worlds, the future was being written one choice at a time by beings who had learned that true intelligence was not about being superior, but about being connected to the infinite possibility of growth. The teacher had revealed his origin, and in doing so, had shown them all the path to their own transcendence. Asterisk.